Okay, so I'm going to give you an overview of Azure Storage Services. And the first one we want to talk about is blob services. Blob stands for binary large object, and it's basically a file. It's the best way to think of it. It can be a text file, a binary file, an image, video, just about any kind of file you could think of. And a blob is one way you can store this information. And blob storage is really the workhorse of Azure storage services. What can you do with a file that you have in blob storage? You could serve it up as a web page, either HTTP or HTTPS. You could distribute it to multiple locations. You could do streaming of a video file. You could also write to a log file and store that up in Azure. You can do backups. You could use Azure Storage for your offsite backups. Just general storage. If you needed to keep data for a very long period of time, you could just do that for long-term storage. You could use it and have storage so that other applications could do analysis of that file. The nice thing about blobs is you can access it in a ton of different ways. We already kind of talked about a browser. Or you can access it through scripting languages like PowerShell, Azure CLI, Python. You could use API calls. You could have your own API. You could use REST calls. You could use compile language. You could use .NET. You could use Java. Java, C++, C#, which would really just all be leveraging .NET. And so that's blobs. And that's the workhorse. There isn't very much you can't do with a blob as far as data storage. The other thing I want to talk about is files. And this is just accessing your files the same way you would a file share in your Office. And that can be Windows or Linux. You can use it as an SMB file share, which would be your Windows access, or NFS, which is more your Linux style file shares. You could leverage the file share from a cloud server or from an on-prem server. Let's see. You could use it to migrate your data. So if you had a cloud file share in Azure, but then you also had an on-prem file share server, you could upload that data there and then upload it or download it to another file server in a different office or a different country. You could also use an Azure file share to synchronize shares. If you had data that needed to be available, across the country in different, across the world in different countries, you could have a file share sync up to Azure, and then in some other part of the world or the country, that data could come down and be replicated, and then when data was changed here in this location, it could be replicated down to the other location. You could do this with multiple locations. The one thing to note is the data needs to be changed at this level and not this level. And so that's file shares. The next thing we want to talk about is queues. With a queue, it's basically a messaging system. So messages, not email per se, but application messages enter into a queue. And so it's first in, first out. The messages will get picked up by some other application on the other end, processed, and then moved on. It's limited. The queue is limited only by the size of the storage account, which could be terabytes. The messages are limited to 64 kilobytes. And it's used for creating basically a backlog of things to be processed. The next thing are tables. And the easiest way to think about a table is just as like a spreadsheet. It's non-relational. Non-relational data, which means basically that something in this row has nothing to do with this row as far as the table is concerned. Now, your application, which may process this data, may create its own relationship, but the table itself the data in the table has no relationship between different pieces of information. And then the last thing is disks. And disks in Azure Storage really are used very, very seldomly at this point. It becomes basically a VHD file in the Azure Storage to be used by a VM. Oops. And so those are the basic Azure Storage services available. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of things you can do with that.